rural areas really safer than cities? The reason I started asking this question was because I saw a Reddit thread where people were asking, what's the most dangerous city you've ever been to? While that was super interesting, I read all the way to the bottom of the Reddit thread and read all the comments. I had to admit it was anecdotal. It wasn't really based on real data about safety of different neighborhoods and cities. And I started getting curious. Why did the person who made the question on Reddit automatically assume that the most dangerous place that a person had likely been was a city? Well, I have lived in some very dangerous rural areas, so it got me started thinking. In the United States, we usually have this kind of bias that we assume that cities are really dangerous and rural areas are going to be a lot safer. But I wondered if that was actually true. Are rural areas really safer than cities? Let's look at the data I found. What I found overall was that yes, probably rural areas have less crime per person than cities do. Let's look at the data that says that rural areas are safer than cities first, but then I'm going to question that. I found several lines of research that actually questioned that idea, so we'll talk about that in a minute. But first, most research agrees that rural areas do have lower crime rates than cities do. And this seems to be true even across the world, not just in the United States. I found research from 1999 that said that, as a general rule across the world, of course, this is not every city every time, not every rural area every time, but as a general global average, crime rates for every major crime are lower in rural areas than they are in cities. This research studied 55 different countries and found that the number one risk factor for crime was living in a city. And this seems to have been true for a while. From 1966 to 1997, violent crime was somewhere between 5 and 10 times higher in large cities than it was in rural areas. One other interesting thing to note about crime in cities is that crime does not happen evenly across a city. Instead, crime tends to be concentrated in what criminologists call hotspots. They're just small neighborhoods that have most of the crime in the city. So the vast majority of people living in a city, even a city that has a reputation for being scary and crime-ridden, most of those people are living in very safe areas. So I told you that most researchers seem to agree that crime is more common in cities than it is in rural areas. But I did find some researchers who disagree with this idea. One set of research brought up the question that maybe rural people have just as much crime as people in urban areas, but rural crime is underreported. In rural areas, when a crime happens, the police just don't report it as often as they would if they were in an urban area. So this theory would say that either urban and rural areas actually have the same amount of crime, or maybe it's that cities have slightly more crime than rural areas, but not nearly as big a difference between the city and the rural area as it seems like on the surface. Why do some researchers believe that rural crime is underreported? Well, there are lots of reasons. People in rural areas might be reluctant to contact the police after a crime has happened to them because they're afraid of losing reputation in the community or privacy concerns. I can imagine lots of types of crimes that people might be a victim of, but they really don't want their neighbors to know that they were victimized in this way, so they just never contact the police. Another thing researchers believe may be true is that rural people often know each other better than people in cities do, so they may deal with problems internally without relying on law enforcement. For example, you can imagine someone in a rural area coming home and finding their TV gone, and they know exactly who stole their TV. And instead of contacting the police, they contact the thief's brother and say, hey, your brother stole my TV again, bring it back to me. When you have these kind of close knit ties in a rural area, sometimes you can just deal with these problems on your own without having to get the cops involved. Another reason researchers cite is that many rural people live way out in the middle of nowhere, so far away from law enforcement that they know that law enforcement is going to take way too long to get there, so they just deal with a problem themselves, whatever that problem is. Another thing that researchers point to is the idea that rural officers aren't anonymous to the people that they're reporting, unlike urban officers. In cities, most police officers are going on calls and talking to people that they probably don't know or don't know very well. And that's not true in rural areas. In rural areas, police officers may experience a lot of pressure to not report a crime. You can easily imagine a police officer in a rural area catching someone shoplifting. And then when they talk to the family says, oh, please don't report her shoplifting. This is going to ruin her reputation. We'll make sure she doesn't shoplift ever again. And the officer agrees because there's so much like social pressure to not report the person who committed the crime. Research shows that even homicides, even murders, are less likely to be recorded accurately in rural areas than they are to be recorded accurately in cities. And there are lots of reasons for this, but it does show that the records in rural areas of crimes committed are just not accurate. Researchers also found that in rural police stations, a lot of those police stations for many years have been lacking the proper equipment to be able to transmit data back to national authorities or the FBI. So, rural police stations have been underreporting the incidents of crime in their community to national authorities. Now, that does seem to be changing. Rural areas are catching up and having the same technology that cities have. So, theoretically, this gap between the number of crimes reported in rural areas and the number of crimes reported in cities should be disappearing if that technology really is a factor. Urban and rural crime rates are slowly changing to match each other. So, to some degree, our perception of rural areas as being crime free and cities as full of crime, that perception is a little bit old. It's kind of dated to 50 years ago, 20 years ago, but it's becoming less and less true. Violent crime declined dramatically from the 1990s to the mid 2000s all across the US. However, that decline was much steeper in urban and suburban areas than it was in rural areas. For example, let's look at the aggravated assault rate in 1993. In 1993, the assault rate was 163% higher in urban areas than it was in rural areas, and it was 43% higher in suburban areas than it was in rural areas. So you can see in 1993, assaults really were much more likely to happen in cities than they were in rural areas. But let's look at the numbers from 2005. Again, we're looking at the aggravated assault rates. In 2005, there were 18% more assaults in urban areas than there were in rural areas. So definitely the assault rate was higher, but it wasn't so dramatically higher as it had been in 1993. And the assault rate in 2005 was actually 69% lower in suburban areas than it was in rural areas. So by 2005, the suburbs were actually safer in terms of aggravated assault than the rural areas were. And I noticed this pattern as I looked at more and more and more recent data. It seemed as though the division between urban areas and rural areas disappeared. I found some 2017 research that claimed that population density had nothing at all to do with crime. So, this data would show that urban areas don't have any more crime than rural areas. Now, I will say that was an outlier, and most of the other research disagreed, but I do think it's interesting that this difference between urban and rural areas is disappearing so much that some research is even claiming that there's no difference at all. Other more modern research still claims that there is a difference between rural and urban crime rates, just that that difference isn't nearly as dramatic as it used to be. So, why is the difference between urban and rural crime rates slowly disappearing? Well, it could possibly be that, like we talked about in our last section, that rural police are finally actually reporting all the crime that really has been happening this whole time in rural areas. That is possible. There are some other theories as well that have been tested through research that seem to be true. Researchers have found that the biggest change has been income. There have been changes in the average income of people living in rural areas versus people living in urban areas. At this point, people living in rural areas are significantly poorer than people living in cities, on average, of course. Today, rural areas have more property crime because, on average, they're poorer. Let's summarize. Most research, especially from the past 40 years, unequivocally finds that cities really are a lot more dangerous than rural areas. However, some research questions that idea and claims that rural police officers just are not reporting rural crimes as accurately as urban police officers are. And even among people who think that the crimes are reported accurately, everyone seems to agree that this difference between rural areas and urban areas is decreasing, it's disappearing, and some even claim that it's already gone, that urban and rural areas have the same amount of crime.